Dear everyone, welcome to the fourth of our Takhayul Nativeness and Emergent Issues podcast series organized by the members of the ERC project named Takhayul at the UCL's Institute for Global Prosperity, the IGP. I am Sertaç Sehikoğlu, the primary investigator of this 5-year project. The need to this podcast series emerged due to a number of reasons. Firstly, the members of this team, as many of you may already be familiar, are often native scholars who have expertise about the very geography. The project in 11 different countries in Eastern Europe, Middle East, South Asia, often referred to as the Global South. That being said, those very contexts are more vulnerable to global changes and crises, as we have seen in a number of events that took place in the last 6 months, including the flood catastrophe in Pakistan, a result of the global warming. Thus, the members of this team have suggested to create a platform where we can address the emergent issues as they happen with other scholars, intellectuals, and activists. The fourth of our podcast series is put together in the aftermath of the earthquake that created a catastrophic damage in Turkey and in Syria. Marked as the most significant earthquake of the century, the long-lasting effects of these multiple earthquakes is yet to be known. As a project team, we wanted to have a conversation about global precarities and catastrophe with this podcast. And for this, I have the privilege of hosting 3 amazing friends and colleagues who are quite significant with the way they're able to pour their hearts and minds into what they do, what they author, and how they think, in the way the terms intellectual, scholar, and or activists do not feel enough. Dr. Aslı Zengin is an assistant professor in the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. Her research lies at the intersection of ethnography, of queer and trans lives and deaths, medical legal regimes of sex and gender and sexuality, critical studies of violence and sovereignty, as well as transnational aspects of LGBTQ movements in the Middle East, with a special focus on Turkey. She's also a queer feminist and has been involved in the Feminist Solidarity Group for Disaster in Turkey since the February 6th, the earthquake. Dr. Omar Al-Ghazi is an associate professor in the Department of Media and Communications at LSE. He works on the geopolitics of global communications, particularly in relation to news, media, and popular culture. He is interested in political contestation of narratives around digital technologies, as well as of representations of time and memory, with a focus on the Middle East and North Africa. Dr. Sumin Kalya is a political anthropologist and part of our Takhayul project research team at the UCL's Institute for Global Prosperity. She studies political Islam and civil society while placing them in the broader framework of political culture. Her research deploys ethnographic tools to explore cultural and social processes which shape political activism in South Asia. Dr. Kalya's project at Takhayul examines the role of imagination in generating expectations and actions for the future. So without further ado, I'd like to turn to Dr. Aslı Zengin. Yes, Dr. Zengin, I'd like to start with you, as I believe you have been in the region that was hit by the earthquake as part of a feminist solidarity group. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Sertaç, Zishan, and Hazal for organizing this very important roundtable. Today, I'm not going to speak as an academic, but as a queer activist who has been involved in feminist relief efforts for the earthquake in Turkey. I will try to explain why feminism significantly matters as a response to disasters, because disasters reveal and intensify already existing relations of power and forms of discrimination and exclusion. Gender and sexual discrimination is one of them. The recent disaster in Turkey, Kurdistan, and Syria has once again shown that women, queer, and trans people are among those who shoulder the harshest costs of the earthquake. I will briefly lay out the gendered, sexual, and racialized fault lines that have deepened the impact of this catastrophe. And then I will summarize our relief efforts as the Feminist Solidarity Group for Disaster in Istanbul. Since day one, we have been working together with two major Kurdish women's organizations in Diyarbakir, the Rosa Women's Association and the Free Women's Movement, TCA, who have shown strong presence in, especially in the absence of the state in the earthquake zone and in the face of women's dismissal for their particular situation and needs. Through our conversation today, I would also like to call on an international feminist solidarity and support. I went to Adıyaman for a week with a group of feminists. In Adıyaman, thousands had deserted their city. Standing buildings were abandoned. There were no lights in the city. Many of the poorest had to remain in the city center. This impoverished population was also strongly divided by racialized lines. For example, Roma communities and Syrian refugees were at the bottom of this hierarchy and had limited access to camps and relief centers. People whose buildings were slightly or moderately damaged had pitched tents in the area next to their apartments, surveilling potential thieves and protecting their household furniture, goods, and other valuable items. These were the only valuables some people had managed to save after long years of work. The situation was even harsher in certain villages where survivors migrated from hard-hit city centers and took shelter in their extended family members' damaged houses or tents in the gardens. Some villagers had to sleep in barns with their animals. Among the villages we visited, some tents or houses hosted 4 to 5 families from Adıyaman city center. In these households, women and girls were responsible for domestic chores and sustenance of life itself. This gendered division of labor was largely invisible. Our friends who worked in the rubbles during the first week after the earthquake stressed that it was heartbreaking to find women in children's room next to their beds while men were found nearby the exit door. Many women's initial response was to first rescue their children rather than themselves. Another issue that risked women's lives was the gendered dress code. Because the earthquake caught everyone in their sleep, some women with nightgowns refrained from stepping outside before wearing their headscarves and changing their clothes. So women died or risked their lives because of religious and moral expectations about their bodily displays in public. And men did not necessarily have to deal with similar expectations at the moment of the earthquake. So they could not change their clothes and underwear, like women in general. They could not change their clothes or underwear since the moment of the earthquake. Lack of water, soap, and detergent made it impossible for them to maintain their hygiene. Some of them had started developing health problems. In the first weeks, it was hard to find a private space to change their clothes, especially. And in one of the villages, a young woman mentioned that all village women had their menstruation at the same time the day after the earthquake. They could not find any menstrual pads. When initial relief materials arrived, they could find diapers for babies and toddlers, but no pads for themselves. So they used baby diapers during their menstruation. They had difficulty also talking about and asking for their needs with men. So in response to these emergency circumstances, we organized the Purple Track campaign for 2 cities, Adıyaman and Antakya. The idea of Purple Track was first raised by Kurdish women who were working in the earthquake zone. They themselves were impacted by the earthquake in Diyarbakir. At the same time, they were the first ones to show up for emergency relief efforts, canvassing with women in neighboring towns impacted by the earthquake to understand their specific needs. As feminists in Istanbul, we started holding a series of meetings to immediately participate in these relief efforts. While a group of us had already traveled to the earthquake zone to work in the rubbles in the first week of the earthquake, the rest of us initiated the Purple Truck campaign for Adıyaman first. Based on daily updates from the city, we revised the list of emergency items to be transported to Adıyaman. Our campaign was based on raising public awareness about these women-specific needs and storing item-specific donations in 3 main locations in Istanbul. These items included hygiene kits, menstrual pads, wet wipes, diapers for kids and seniors, slippers, underwear, clothing, wash bowls, broom, soap, shampoo, detergent, toilet tissue, paper towel, bulks of assorted grain, veg oil, and flour, and also colored books and toys for children. Once we filled up the truck, it departed from Istanbul on February 21st. On the same night, a group of us also took a flight to Adıyaman to distribute women the items according to a designated list of neighborhoods and villages. Friends who remained in Istanbul started the organization of the second Purple Truck campaign, this time for Antakya Samandağ. Until the arrival of our Purple Truck campaign, many women mentioned to us in Adıyaman that nobody else had either recognized or prioritized their needs. We also established the women's tent in the Adıyaman campsite, which was organized under the coordination of the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, HDP. And this campsite was unique in terms of its inclusive politics towards the survivors, regardless of their sectarian, religious, and ethnic identities. For instance, while most Syrians were denied tents in other camps, here 1/5 of the tents were allocated for them. Every sign in the campsite was also written in Kurdish, Arabic, and Turkish. This inclusive attitude towards social difference also made this campsite a safe space for our feminist, queer, and trans presence. In the campsite, the gender division of labor mapped itself onto the tent life. Child and elderly care, reproduction of household, and emotional and physical labor were all on women's shoulders. There was no space of escape for women in tents. They had a tendency to spend most of their day in these tents without having a time of their own and socializing with other women. Mostly men dominated the common spaces in the camp, making it difficult for women to claim and use the spaces for their own social needs. Because of the circumstances, it was very important to create a space for women, queers, and trans people where they could feel safe and comfortable without family and social pressure. At the beginning, when we pitched the tent, the women's tent, it attracted only a few women. Then we started visiting the tents in the camp and informing women about the tent. As days went by, many women became more aware of the space and told their friends, neighbors, and other women from their extended families. They started to visit our tent regularly to claim some leisure time for themselves and talk with us and each other. Our efforts in the women's tent usually orient around creating a momentary cycle of joy and pleasure, a material and sensual moment of normalcy that used to exist prior to the earthquake. These are small moments of escape from the harsh reality and the responsibilities women have to shoulder, but they still matter. We need to maintain the space in the long term, and many women were highly enthusiastic in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, and they showed their great willingness to donate, spend time in Adıyaman, or participate in other relief activities. These numbers, however, have started decreasing compared to the first weeks of the disaster. So it's important to also receive international feminist support now. You can contact us via afetiçinfeministler@gmail.com. I think it's going to be posted on the website when this video recording is also posted. You can learn more about the specific forms of support you could provide if you contact this email address. And then you can also follow us on our social media account at Afet için Feminist. And I guess I'm going to stop here, and maybe we can continue to discuss more during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Zengin. I just want to kind of remind everyone also that the detailed information is going to be available on YouTube, where we are sharing this live, and later on the podcast when it's out, and the channel UCL Minds, under which Tahayyül Nativeness series. Thank you very much, Aslı Zengin. And without further ado, Omar Alghazi, Dr. Alghazi.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the organizers, and for giving us the opportunity to discuss this painful and important topic and discussion. And I will perhaps start with noting the importance of a feminist approach, and kind of echoing what Asa was saying, not because I'm I've been on the ground or kind of following the immediate aftermath, but as an academic who is interested in Syria and the region more broadly. I note the problem of how the region is continuously talked about in relation to geopolitics and military kind of changes and advances that really erases the struggles of people. Like the scale of the disaster really shows how the geopoliticization of everything to do with Syria in particular really works against people, and part of this is the problem of punditry as well, like the people whose voices are the loudest in commenting on the disaster. They speak about kind of shifts in the power between different states, between militias, and what this would kind of tell us about the Middle East international relations, and this continues to work against the people, erasing their struggles and priorities, and adding insult to injury to everything that's unfolding in Syria. And while I don't know, I find it actually quite difficult to talk about it, because I think the scale of the disaster, particularly when it comes to Syria, is really difficult to put in words. Just the very idea that there are some people who have been stuck under the rubble multiple times before, due to bombings, and currently due to an earthquake in northwest Syria. When you read the stories of people and individuals, and how the pain and the trauma that they carry, I think it becomes really difficult to actually kind of understand or even put in words the pain that entails in loss of loved ones, and what bodies of survivors continue to carry, from injury to physical injuries to psychological injuries. But certainly, when it comes to the natural disaster, there is, of course, the earthquake is a natural phenomenon, but the layers of how it the kind of injustices, the layers of injustice that unfold are very much political. Even the very idea of like the structural integrity of buildings. Of course, there's been just a lot of coverage about Turkey in relation to urban planning and permits and corruption and so forth. In Syria, in addition to that layer, there's also the structural vulnerability of buildings in areas that have been bombed for years during the war by the regime, by the Russian military as well, and being kind of scenes of conflict and warfare more broadly. So there is that layer that made so many buildings in the poorest areas. Let's say when we talk about cities, like a city like Aleppo, in the working class areas of Aleppo, but also in villages and towns across the northwest of Syria. And there is kind of the additional layers of thinking about the impact of sanctions, for example. Again, an aspect that usually is only there's only interest in it in relation to kind of the use of sanctions as a political and geopolitical tool, but we know that sanctions never work in the way that they're intended, and they're cruel measures when it comes to how they impact to how they impact people. In kind of the punditry around the sanctions, the technicalities of how it unfolded during the aftermath of the earthquake dominated, but I think to think about it more broadly is also important, and there are examples how it made the lives of Syrians much more difficult, including the ability of Syrians to transfer money to their Syrians abroad, the Syrian diaspora, to transfer money to their families within the geography of Syria, but also the ability of NGOs to work within. And of course, the earthquake only made issues of poverty, of of health, of public health, of safety, all these aspects of the biopolitics of life, basically, about the ability to survive and carry on, have been made so much worse. And like, even so, there is, we haven't even talked about let's say military strikes that happen in the aftermath of the earthquake. Israel bombed Damascus on February 19, days after the earthquake happened in the country, and bombed Aleppo on March 7. And there were civilian casualties. In Damascus, 15 people died, and many more people lost their homes. And to think that such bombing a country that has just gone through an earthquake, like, it really, I think we have to stop and think about that, like how and how that passes as if it's just another episode in the unfolding geopolitical crisis, and without really thinking of how kind of depraved the morality and kind of the respect to human life that entails, to have people made homeless a week, not even a week after a country is hit by an earthquake. And that also includes the Syrian regime. Like the northwest Syria was in fact actually bombed by the Syrian military in the aftermath of the earthquake, and there were kind of there was fighting between militias and the army there. So there is there is this added layer that makes it even more kind of difficult to really think of the scale of what people there must be going through. The politics of aid distribution, that was very much again like a geopolitical football. The Syrian regime saw the earthquake as a chance to get legitimacy on the international stage and seek normalization of ties with different governments, and we're already seeing a lot of kind of movement in that regard, with particularly within Arab countries, kind of recognizing the Syrian regime and reinitiating kind of diplomatic recognition after years of boycott. But even how NGOs are subject to various kinds of campaigns within Syria to discredit non-regime affiliated organizations, start rumors around them that they're actually stealing money from the West and not doing anything to help people. So instead of even allowing, any sort of aid and improvement of the lives of people, or allowing organizations to operate, these organizations find themselves having to kind of face campaigns online against them, rumors against them. Already we see a lot of politics around reconstruction and urban planning in areas that are dealt with by the state as conflict zones, and areas that there is an interest in a kind of rearrangement of urban life. So already that has been kind of part of the contention and struggle that's happening, especially when foreign governments like Iran, for example, are involved in the kind of in giving money to urban reconstruction initiatives. And even within the Syrian regime, there are reports of kind of competition between different figures to appear to be giving aid, and that is kind of talking about the situation in Syria. If we talk about Syrians in Turkey, already I think Asla mentioned kind of the discrimination against Syrians, and actually, given all what I just said about how dire things are in Syria, there are many Syrians in Turkey who went back to Syria because after they became homeless, they just found it really difficult to stay in Turkey, to navigate kind of their safety, to get aid within Turkey. And I know from acquaintances and friends that it was very difficult for Syrians to actually stay in many camps in the affected areas, or even move to other safe areas within Turkey. So the kind of the racism was somehow like exacerbated and justified with what happened. And just to conclude, like this kind of thinking about the situation is again to bring up that issue of how, in the general framing of what's happening in the region as a whole, there is kind of what I think is a sickening level of selective solidarity that really puts the people of and there really needs to be kind of a reframing of even the nation state focus in that sense, because if we look at the region as a whole, we also cannot neglect what's happening in Syria, in regime and rebel areas. So there is a commonality in kind of the experiences of the kind of all these layers of tragedy that I've been talking about, but also in Lebanon, for example, with the economic collapse, and in Palestine, we cannot forget also the struggle that Palestinians continue to embark on, with kind of the unprecedented, or not we say unprecedented, but it's really the escalating kind of attacks that they are facing across Palestine, and particularly in the West Bank. So I'll stop here, and hopefully we can talk more in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Omar. Actually, before we move on to Sumrin, who's going to tell us a little bit about this huge earthquake that took place in 2005. I think the scale was 8.1, and what was done and what could have been done since then in Pakistan. I want to say that there are a number of elements that I kind of, as a chair, I'm feeling this urge of talking about. But we are also receiving some questions from chat box. So I'm going to hold my horses, move on with Sumrin, and then we will start the Q&A. Thank you, Sumrin. I think you need to unmute yourself, or let me try if I can.
No, I think I'm done. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, it's a sad juncture that we are having to come across these kind of difficult conversations at quite a quick succession. Just 2 months ago, we were talking about the Pakistani earthquake, which also created such a huge disaster across the country. And right now, talking about Syria, Turkish and Syrian earthquake, I feel like sometimes it's important to reflect back on things that have happened before and these tragedies that occurred before. So basically, I'm going to talk about the Pakistani earthquake. It's been a long time. 2005, it was about 18 years ago. And somehow we can have like a longer durée understanding of the consequences these kind of intense human tragedies can bring. Well, I'll begin with mostly a brief idea of what actually happened and who were the real actors on the ground, where my focus will remain mostly on this politics of aid, and then how in the long term this politics of aid actually turns out. So this earthquake was about 8.2 Richter scale on October 8th, and the major areas affected were the northern areas and the Kashmir, the Pakistan administered Kashmir, and also the Indian occupied Kashmir. And more than 100,000 people died, and more than 140,000 people were injured. And cities were completely flat. More like Balakota city was completely in rubbles. There were people cut off without any kind of access. No government, no agencies, no doctors were there for quite a long time. And the earthquake displaced 3.5 million people, and an estimated 1.6 million people went without adequate food supply. And there were long-term also effects of the earthquake, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. But the Pakistanis actually came in a lot. They mobilized. The biggest amount of mobilization for support came from Pakistanis themselves. And people, just in a week's time, about 1.7 billion rupees were collected in the President's Relief Fund, and $360 million were received from abroad. But then we need to talk about the context in which this earthquake took place. At that time, Pakistan was being under the rule of the military government of Musharraf. And the country was also one of the frontline states of the US war on terror. So the military was fighting the Afghan Taliban on the other side of the border. And because of its stronghold within the country and also beyond, in the relief efforts, the military managed to be the only major actor, and all the other people who were coming for support, international NGOs or even the local ones, they were relying heavily on the military to access the flood or the earthquake hit areas. And there was no national disaster management authority at the time. Local government institutions were also absent, and so which is why the whole relief and rescue work was largely in the control of the military. What happened, because of the Pakistan's geostrategic position at the time as a frontline state, Pakistan did get immense support from the US and the NATO military forces. The international community overall had a poor response, although, in fact, initially, even the United States was not very supportive. But again, going back to so the military was one actor. The other actors were these international NGOs, which were relied on the military. And there was a third actor also, which actually created a lot of, which was around which a lot of noise was created in the international media, and that was Jamaatul Dawa, an Islamist organization which had connections to jihadist groups within Kashmir. And there was a lot of criticism on the role of Jamaatul Dawa at the time. But what we keep forgetting is that when such crises happen, you need infrastructure. And somehow the mosques networks are so much wider, even more than the local government institutions, that they end up being the main locations from where these kind of rehabilitation activities can be carried out. But in the long run, what happened to all these three actors? I'll begin with Musharraf, the military. Within 3 years, military rule was ousted in 2008. The Islamists also lost their support and were voted out when the democracy came in. And the US image worsened, although it didn't really get any better, and US was seen more as a fair weather friend, because it was seen that AIDS programs have much more to do with buying or renting influence related to Pakistani military and promote US security interests rather than helping Pakistanis. And as a social response in the long term, it was hugely difficult to build back. More than 7,000 public schools just in the Muzaffarabad district were destroyed. Not even half of them have been rebuilt, even though 18 years have passed. And children who were under the age of 3 at the time of the earthquake accumulated huge height deficits and scored significantly bad on academic tests. And but on the other hand, this earthquake also resulted in the creation of NDMA, which was like the National Disaster Management Authority. It was created in 2007, in which it was decided that all armed forces and NGOs and agencies will work through the NDMA to conduct all kinds of operations. Since the earthquake was in this contested territory of Kashmir, a little bit influence from India was rather a good surprise, because India supported and helped in the rehabilitation efforts, despite the fact that the peace bridge, which was opened just a year before the earthquake happened, was also destroyed in the earthquake. But the earthquake actually managed to ease the tensions across the border. But in the longer run, as I said, all those actors who were active in the relief efforts did not receive any long-term advantage. In fact, partly majorly because of their failure to provide adequate support, they accumulated more blame than credit. And we can actually then understand what might be the long-term effects in terms of the political geopolitics, the local politics in the aftermath of certain these tragedies, and also the geopolitics that Omar has been talking about. Well, that's all from my side.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sumrin. I think we can have, well, before we are starting the Q&A, I want to say a couple of things, if that's okay. First of all, this was extremely difficult for the team members. This particular podcast was extremely difficult for the team members to put together. Zishan Köker, Hazal Aydin, and myself, we have been kind of trying to find a way to make ourselves useful, which is also one of the reasons why I kind of I wanted Aslı Zengin on this platform today, as somebody who was active and was doing a lot more than we could. But we were torn apart between trying to make ourselves useful while following the news, and I want to kind of clarify what it means to be following the news as a Turkish person in the first couple of days, first 2 weeks. That also meant that we were able to follow in our mother tongue live tweets sent from under the rubble by the survivors, whose voices later on was silenced one by one. Like, its effect was quite enormous, its emotional effect. And therefore, putting together this one from the day one, we were like, do we have the energy? Do we have not have the energy? But I think it all goes back to the very title we ended up putting to the Tahayyül, Nativeness and Emergent Issues series, because Omar said something about voice, right? Whose voice is being heard in the aftermath of such disasters. That's one of the things. Like, we are obviously dealing with 11 countries. We are from those countries as the Tahayyül team, and things are happening in the global south on those contexts. And then we would be finding ourselves in situations where we are listening to the accounts of so-called experts of the region. And we need to do a couple of things. One is we need to make ourselves use this as a solidarity platform, and have our conversations as the natives, but also change the very genre, the very rhetoric of this expertise conversations. Like, too professional. We can't be too professional in times like this, and we shouldn't expect extreme professionality, which only comes from position of privilege. I wanted to kind of state these as the chair of today's conversation, and turn to Hazal's question, if that's okay for everyone. Hazal asks in the chat box, how should we discuss the Turkish state's inability to solve this crisis? Is it just failed state bureaucracy / corruption, or are we seeing a form of necropolitics, a selective let's live and let die? I think this is directed to Dr. Zengin.
Are we going to collect questions, or are we going to go one by one?
We can listen to you as long as we keep the answers succinct, so that we will get, because I'm guessing some people are also trying to articulate their question.
Okay. The state is definitely necropolitics, and I don't think the state is failing. I think the state is using its all kind of technical structure to accumulate the resources in one hand, and preventing people from just distributing solidarity and support resources. Like, for example, what we have witnessed in this particular crisis was this hyper ultra centralization of the state that ends up in one person's decision. So many people died under the rubble because all those rescue teams were waiting for a signed paper, a signed authority from Erdogan, going back to all the way to Erdogan. So this kind of centralization blocks so many people from accessing people and rescuing them from under the rubble. For example, there were miners who were very well trained. They are the most equipped group of people who could go into the rubble and save people. They have all the technical information, but they were just kept at airports for hours and days rather than being sent to these particular destinations of the earthquake. Or the army was not put into force to actually also facilitate these kinds of relief efforts, rescue efforts. Because of just this one man is making all these decisions. So in that sense, I don't think it's a failed state. It's a very strong state, but it's just operating in a way that we don't like it to operate. It's just using all the power and this doesn't allow any space for civil society organizations or any kind of opponent parties to create their own kind of, solidarity networks, which we all did in one way or other, but under the pressure of the government, because the government was also appropriating so much relief materials while we were trying to transfer them from one place to the other. Or there was so much corruption, and the corruption becomes another kind of economy that the state facilitates in these moments of crisis. So this is one answer, but the other one is the necropolitical part. It's a very long answer. I have so much to tell about this, even just with the single example of this person who couldn't produce a death document for her parents under the rubble, but the latest signals from their parents' phone was detected under these rubbles. But then when the machines came in and excavated the rubbles, they couldn't find anyone. So there was no one to be found under the rubble. So they couldn't be listed as dead. But the child knows that they are actually there. Her parents are dead. So like you get to see all these like very telling examples of necropolitics unfolding as a state structure through its bureaucracies. So, or just, people had to die because of the prevention of other civil society organizations. So the state actually let people die under the rubble. I think it's a very strong state with a very strong necropolitical agenda and a structure, I would say, but I don't want to take up so much time because it's a very long conversation. There are so many examples, but I want to also hear from my friends as well.
Thank you, Dr. Zengin. Dr. Al-Ghazi, do you want to add anything to this from your observations and expertise from Syria?
No, I think what Asa said covers it. Thanks.
Then, if I may, I actually do have a question, well, to everyone, but beginning with you, I guess. And that is, so when you were speaking, I was thinking about, like I think you used the phrase, "How did this just pass?" as another episode, and this was something I've been kind of feeling and observing quite a lot. Not only how Israel was attacking the region just days after the earthquake, but also how the news about this entire earthquake that was obviously quite a kind of catastrophic one, just as one of the many miseries of the Middle East, as if like somehow Middle Eastern people are ontologically equipped to experience and live violence, let alone catastrophe. And I know your work actually, like your entire scholarship deals with like whose narratives are heard, how the narratives are kind of changed, and but I was kind of thinking quite a bit since the earthquake, and as a scholar who's living in the UK, about the kind of concept of voice quite a lot, right? And this is the angle I was thinking that you might want to add a couple of notes to, because having a voice is not whether you are making yourself heard, whether that voice gets into somebody else's ears, but also whether you have power over your own narrative, whether you are just a bystander, or when you are telling your narrative, it's used as something else, or it's silenced, or it became like negligible, and then it's kind of, it was also connected back to something you said even earlier in your talk, adding another injury, like just to this. I just wanted to kind of point this out, whether you want to, well, all of you actually want to add anything about how we think about certain parts of the world, and we all know that there are precarities attached to a range of parts of the global south. But we also know that those precarities exist because of the global power dynamics. So I'm going to stop here, or I'm going to end up giving more answers to my own question, I suppose.
Yeah, like I think in terms of voice, I think the language that comes more naturally to us in this political moment are kind of like a neoliberal take on voice, as kind of like almost like a search for an authentic voice, or like there's that part. There is even like when, in your reference to like the multiple tragedies that people face, and like think about let's say the idea of resilience, which now like scholars from the Middle East are kind of completely rejecting, because it somehow exceptionalizes the struggles of people there, as if they have resilience in their genes, while it is more about like actually surviving and kind of navigating multiple risks and precarities, and navigating a really difficult life, basically, and kind of holding on to moments of joy and happiness. Like I'm reminded of the poem by a colleague, Rafif, who says, like, we teach people how to live in relation to Palestinians, which is kind of like there is like there's an insistence to live in that sense, but we also like cannot escape thinking about structures of power, as you mentioned. So while kind of recognizing, I think, the ability of people to navigate these these multiple layers of tragedies, there's also like structural ways that basically determine how they talk about it as well. And I think if you listen to what Syrians say, like the pain is just so much that oftentimes like people are unable to actually articulate what they're feeling. And like for me, being in the West, being in the academy, I think like one way to kind of think about voice is not to overuse words like trauma, like like this also kind of like words from psychology that have become so commonplace in everyday language in the academy, that I think like the overuse of certain words also disempower people, because you're taking away the language that is meant for actually traumatized people. But by overusing terms, we also kind of disarm the force behind words. So it is to think about our positions and think about voice in relation to power structures, I would say.
Thank you. So, okay, here is, thank you very much. Anybody wants to add? Well, what I'll do, actually, there are 2 more questions coming up, and we barely have 10 minutes. So what I'll do is, if you can hold on to your answer, if you want to add anything about voice, I'm guessing Sumrin might want to kind of add her own account for the aftermath of Pakistan regarding voice, or Aslı might want to also add her notes. But I'll take the rest of the questions and then go around in the panel before we wrap up, if that's okay. So Gregory Jackson is asking, How will the earthquake shape the politics of the upcoming election? Will Erdogan get quote-unquote credit for leading in a crisis while suppressing other actors, or will he get the blame? Again, between quotes. And Fatima Sadeghi is asking about the role of external contractors and their role in the increase of the disease, including the lack of accountability and transparency in engineering the infrastructure, something that has been talked about since day one in different ways and different levels. And Mariam Zishan Kukar is asking about how we can address the geopolitical implications of government's neglect or failure to adequately respond to natural disasters, particularly in vulnerable or politically marginalized communities. She's also asking about what steps can be taken, but I want to also hear your notes about what can the global community do when it comes to offering humanitarian aid to the region if the state is such an aggressive actor in managing that received aid. Okay, and I'll start with this. So my screen is rotating in the same way. I think YouTube screen is rotating here. Aslı, Omar, and Sumrin, please. You can choose the questions.
Sumrin speaks first this time because she couldn't get to speak. Huh?
You are on mute, Sumrin.
Well, the first question is mainly about the Turkish local politics concerning Erdogan. I'm not on the ground, so I don't have like a lot of insider knowledge into the way local politics is coming across. But from what I hear, I do see that the government is getting a lot of blame. If I'm wrong, please feel free to correct me, Sertaç, or those who were engaged in the local grounds and know more than I do. And perhaps this is not a good sign for him. But again, and as I said, from what I gathered in the long run impact of Pakistani politics, how it changed, all the actors that were engaged at the time were failing to provide support. And therefore, they did amass a lot of blame and were eventually somehow voted out or pushed out of the Pakistani political scene.
Is that your part, Sumrin?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, but we are answering all these questions, right? Yani, we are not going.
You
one
can
by
also
one.
pick and choose, obviously.
Yeah.
Thinking, yeah.
So on the third or the fourth day of the earthquake, Erdogan went on the TV and then he started scolding people, the victims of the earthquake, just with such an aggressive posture. And so that was the first official state government speech directed at the victims while they were still like under the rubbles trying to be saved, and there were still like living people screaming from under the rubbles. So that was cruel, harsh, and violent. And the oppositional party took a totally different kind of approach, and he went to the earthquake zone and he was just, with people from the pro-Kurdish party, and he had a very soft speech, like embracing people, trying to support them. So that set a kind of polarized political discourses about the earthquake itself, the victims for the victims of the earthquake, how these two parties are going to approach. And so that speech itself made Erdogan even more undesired among many, because he is blamed for causing this disaster, because his whole economic agenda, neoliberal economic agenda, has been based on construction business. So he made all these leases with contractors, with the architects, with the large companies, not necessarily follow the measures that were introduced legally after the 1999 earthquake. So when all these buildings collapsed, so much corruption also emerged on the surface. People just collected material from the collapsed buildings and then saw that actually they were not built according to the earthquake measures, earthquake prevention measures, and all this corrupt economy just after its emergence in the face of this devastation. Erdogan was the person who signed all these agreements. So in a way, now he totally lost lots of support. And Adıyaman, for instance, I can speak more intimately about Adıyaman because I spent some time there with this feminist organization. And Adıyaman was actually Erdogan's representatives are ruling the Adıyaman. So now Adıyaman was a big front for Erdogan's political success. So when he came to Adıyaman while we were there. Of course, we didn't see him in person then, but all day everybody was just talking about this visit and cursing. Because he asked for certain kind of forgiveness, helallik. I don't know how to translate this into English. It's an Islamic, gesture to ask for some kind of, forgiveness. Usually people ask for it at the moment of death, whether you are giving your forgiveness to this person, to the deceased, and people just, collectively, chant, yeah, we give our forgiveness to this person. So that's a moment of like ultimate forgiveness. So he was asking for forgiveness from people. Then that discourse circulated among people. We are not going to give him any kind of forgiveness. We're going to give him hell. We're going to give him curse. Like it totally unleashed this, frustration, disappointment, anger, rage directed against the government itself. So all these feelings are now shaping up the political space in Turkey. So it's not an easy answer, this or that black and white kind of answer I have for your question, but it's also a moment of possibility of a political hope. Like all these coalitions are also emerging in the face of this aggressive state attitude and in the absence of the state, especially in the first week of the disaster. And so civil society organizations, political parties, other activist groups started mobilizing their own resources and their own connections, and they were trying to get to the earthquake zone, and they become more interaction with each other. So it is a devastation, yet at the same time, it's another moment of crisis that just, gives birth to new kind of, formations of political collaboration and coalition. And so that's what I find the most interesting, even beyond elections themselves. For me, that's how the streets is shaping up, how the community is shaping up in terms of this alternative political agendas, and how these political agendas are speaking to each other in this very moment. I find it very hopeful. That I hope that I had lost about the politics in Turkey in a while, but now the history itself is so always surprising. So again, being in the earthquake zone, interacting with all these other organizations, seeing the kind of empowerment people are just creating all together was very inspiring. That I want to highlight.
Thank you.
As a good
Thank you,
note
Dr.
out
Zeynep.
of this really bleak situation.
And Dr. Algazi, last but not least.
Like I'm not going to kind of add anything, but I would just say, like, for like the least we can do is to kind of add, maybe for listeners as well. I know like probably many of us already donated money, but like in Syria, even there isn't like the even capacity for many Syrians to get involved, and we can't really speak of like organizations that are dealing with the situation as part of a civil society. But I think like particular Syrian-led groups, like Mulhem Team, for example, like a kind of a rescue and aid group, like, and the White Helmets as well. Like they're really like kind of holding you feel almost like they're holding the foundations of what hopeful politics could emerge, at least in rescuing people, like literally saving lives and kind of involving Syrians in the aid effort as well. So I think they're worthy of our support.
Well, thank you everyone. I have to say, I think I met with friends and colleagues in London a couple of times in the last 1 month. Every time we have aside from doing an intellectual exchange, our priority wasn't that. Our priority usually is just having that touch, sharing our intellectual minded pain, I suppose, which is exactly how I'm feeling, which is why it's a little bit difficult to wrap up this conversation. But thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for being part of this conversation and for your insights. I hope there won't be too many emergent issues for the Takhayyül team to continue podcast series, but when there is something, we have a team to put things together and hopefully to change the genre of any conversation in the aftermath of such incidents. Yes, thank you very much. If you'd like to add any last notes other than that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you very much, and take care.